We hear a lot these days about computer attacks, data breaches, hacking by foreign government and military units, whether against private networks or U.S. government systems. So it's great to have with us this evening two people who've been working on the cyber challenge for years, both in government and in the private sector. Richard Clarke spent 30 years in the U.S. government, where he served initially at the State Department and Pentagon, before moving to the NSC staff under both Bushes and Clinton, focusing on counterterrorism and becoming the first White House official placed in charge of U.S. cybersecurity policy. Robert Knake, who's now a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, served in the Obama White House for several years as director for cybersecurity policy at the National Security Council. Both men also have consulted for major corporations, cybersecurity companies, and venture capital and private equity firms. And both have been adjunct faculty members teaching graduate students about cybersecurity. The two teamed up a decade ago to write Cyberwar, a bestseller that sounded an alarm about the cyber threat to national security. Much has changed since then, of course. And in their new book, The Fifth Domain, Dick and Rob update their assessments and prescriptions for what nevertheless remains a really scary threat, but one the authors affirm that is eminently capable of being defended against. The book's title refers to how the Pentagon identifies potential conflicts. It used to talk about just 4 domains: land, sea, air, and space. In recent years, cyberspace has become known as the fifth domain. And despite the common perception that cyberspace is hopelessly insecure, Dick and Rob argue in their book that effective measures have been taken and can continue to be taken to make cyber attacks more difficult and more costly to undertake. But they stress that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between government and the private sector. And you're going to hear that central to their approach for addressing the challenge is what they call the concept of cyber resilience. And I'll leave it to them to go into that very interesting approach. We'll get on with their talk, but I just want to urge you, after you hear them this evening, if you haven't already, to get their book and to read it, because it's very thoughtful and very lucid. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Clarke and Robert Knake.
Well, thank you so much. Lots of friends here, familiar place. We came here 10 years ago. We've been here since. But we came here 10 years ago to talk about our book, Cyberwar. And in our book, Cyberwar, 10 years ago, we said, it won't be hackers anymore, living in their mother's basement, having pizza and drinking Red Bull. It'll be nation states. It'll be armies fighting each other. And they won't just be stealing information. They'll be destroying things. And it won't just be minor things. They'll be going after infrastructure. And Wired magazine, the great Wired magazine, did a review. And we thought, oh, great, Wired's giving us a review. And they said, file under fiction. These guys don't know what they're talking about. They're all wrong. So 10 years on, we thought we'd write a book to say, nah. We were right. But we were also wrong.
So what we were right about was obviously the threat. We saw where it was going. We saw where it was emanating from. We didn't get right that it was going to, in fact, be as bad as it has been. We didn't see the Iranians growing their cyber capability. We didn't see the growth of criminal groups to a level in which the criminals are just as good as the best nation states. we certainly didn't see the Russians combining their offensive cyber capability along with their keen understanding of American politics to be able to manipulate elections. So those were the bad things that we didn't predict. But what we also didn't see was that technology was actually going to get better, and that the offensive preference or the offensive advantage that we talked about in 2008 and 2009 when we were writing this book was going to start to erode by 2018 and 2019, thanks to technologies like cloud computing, thanks to new concepts like the kill chain, which we talk about in the book, and that we think it can keep eroding as technologies come online, like artificial intelligence, like quantum computing. Later on in the talk, Dick's going to explain Schrodinger's cat. So
It's dead or alive or both.
But we've really seen, in fact, the emergence of companies who are able to defend themselves even against the most aggressive actors. So if you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes, these are the dogs that don't bark. When there are major cyber attacks and you hear that this company got popped and that company got popped, there are companies that got hit with the same malware, saw it, stopped it, and kept their business going. And the biggest example of this that we talk about in the book is an attack called NotPetya.
So I don't make the names up for these attacks. And I really want to find the people who do, because they're really stupid names. So the biggest attack in history happened a few years ago, cost $10 billion, billion with a B, in insured losses. And it has the stupid name of NotPetya. Well, who the hell was Petya? I mean, anyway, what was NotPetya? The Russian military decided to attack Ukrainian companies. So what did they do? Rather than attack all the Ukrainian companies one at a time, they attacked the Ukrainian kind of equivalent of QuickBooks, an accounting software that every company in Ukraine used. And they got into the software update. You know how you get software updates all the time. Well, and the software updates go right through the firewall, right through the antivirus systems, and right into your hard drive. Well, that's what happened. This company served everybody, their accounting software. The Russians got into it, poisoned it, and this software got served up to every company in Ukraine virtually. Only what that software did was to kill software. It was like Pac-Man. It ran throughout the network very quickly, eating all the software. And so the laptops, the iPhones, the servers, the routers, the printers quickly became pieces of metal that just sat there and blinked because there was no software on them. They didn't do anything. The mistake the Russians made, or maybe it wasn't a mistake, was that the software then jumped onto the internet and it went out to the home offices of the companies in Ukraine. So, for example, there was a company called Mondelez Foods in Ukraine, but they were also here in the US and they were in the UK. Very important to everyone in this room. Mondelez Foods makes Oreos. They also make Ritz crackers. And all of a sudden, all of their production lines stopped. It was the day the Oreos died. But more serious things happened. It got on to the software of the largest container shipping company in the world. And all around the world, in 75 ports around the world, those big container cranes that pick up the containers off ships and put them on the trains, they all stopped. Nobody knew what was in the containers. Nobody knew where the containers were supposed to go. For weeks, nothing moved in those ports. A cancer drug was under production in New Jersey at a company called Merck. Suddenly, the assembly line stopped. All around the world, companies stopped because the software had been destroyed by this thing called NotPetya. So we thought, wow, that was the biggest attack in the world, in the history of the world. We should investigate that. And what we found out when we looked was, yeah, it killed all of these companies. But there were companies that were identical to the ones that got killed. There were hotel companies and aviation companies and banks, and nothing happened to them. It bounced off. So you've all heard about the big famous hacks, Target stores, Marriott, Yahoo, Equifax. How many of you here have been notified that your credit cards have been compromised? Raise of hands. Come on, honesty here. We've all done it, right? But you don't hear about the companies that didn't get hacked. And so we noticed Hyatt Hotels was in Ukraine. They didn't get hacked. Delta Airlines was there. They didn't get hacked. Boeing Aerospace was there. They didn't get hacked. And we started to figure out there's something that those companies have in common that makes them resilient, even to the worst attack in history.
And so, one of the more interesting things about this case, right, is that this was a destructive attack. This caused actual physical damage. And so the results of the attack really became obvious because you couldn't buy Oreos in Walmart, or you couldn't move your shipping container out of New Jersey, right? For the last decade, a lot of the threat has been focused on economic espionage, right? The Chinese stealing intellectual property. And when that happens, the Chinese take it, but you as a company still have it. And so therefore, you may just go on with your business and pretend that didn't happen and ignore the SEC requirements that would say you need to notify your shareholders of that event, because only you, your lawyer, and your investigative firm are actually aware of it, right? That's been the nature of the attack. And so that's been the question that everybody's had is, well, if that's what's happening, how do we know which companies are actually defending themselves well? And the general rule, the general view out there in the world has been, in the world of cybersecurity has been, there are two kinds of companies, right? Those have been hacked and know it, and those who have been hacked and don't know it. And what we saw with NotPetya is, in fact, there's this third category. These companies that are cyber resilient. Now, that line I just used, that was originated by Dmitry Alperovich when he was at McAfee. If you've heard that name in the news recently, it's because I think he just became a billionaire. He's the CTO of CrowdStrike, which is Wall Street's new darling cybersecurity firm. So he's in the business of selling this concept of resilience, but it's a concept that he is selling and that people are buying because it works. So the companies like Microsoft and Oracle and others that were in Ukraine, they'd invested in their security and they'd patched the vulnerability that the malware was used, which was known. And they'd segmented their network so they weren't flat across the entire globe. And you couldn't actually move from the Ukraine office to headquarters without anything in between. And so it's concepts like these that have made cybersecurity, to us at least, possible and achievable under the right circumstances.
So we asked, what do these companies have in common? The ones that are the dogs that don't bark, the ones that survive the attacks. Well, they got three things in common. One, the person in charge of cybersecurity. She's not buried down in the bureaucracy somewhere. She reports high up on the food chain, including to someone on the board of directors. And when she wants to call the CEO, she can get through. That's number one. Number two, the companies have an atmosphere, a culture of security, where they have education, awareness, and training of their staff about security. And number three, and this is the most important one, they spend money on security. We found that companies cluster in two areas on the spending curve. One, about 3%, 4% of their IT network budget on security. Those guys get hacked. Another number up at around 8 to 10%. They're the dogs that do not bark. They're the ones who, using the new technologies that Rob has mentioned, endpoint protection, cloud computing, they survive. And so it comes down to, are you willing to pay to keep your company secure? Or are you willing to pay after the fact for the damages? And after the fact can mean a lot of money. Companies are now getting fined. Equifax, the credit card company, just got fined recently by the FTC a couple of $100 million. They got fined by the government for having a breach. If they had spent 1/10 of that trying to protect their network, they would have survived. So this is a good news story. With existing technology, you can defend corporate networks. We were wrong, this guy and me, 10 years ago when we said that couldn't happen. But while corporations have made advances and corporations are now able to secure their networks, governments aren't doing too well. Governments are still vulnerable. Weapon systems are still vulnerable. And the power grid is still vulnerable.
So one of the things about cybersecurity that's just really weird to people when they first look at it, particularly if you come from the national security community, and particularly if you grew up during the Cold War or worked on Cold War policy. In cybersecurity, right, the mantra since he wrote the first presidential policy on this in 1998 has been that we're going to work on a public-private partnership, and that the onus is really going to be on the private sector, that it's going to be private companies' responsibilities to protect themselves from even nation-state hackers. And you go into a boardroom and you explain this to a CEO and they look at you like you're crazy, right? That's what I pay taxes for, right? That's the government's job, right? The government doesn't tell me that I need to build my own nuclear deterrent, right? They don't come around and give a briefing and say, so the Russians have ICBMs, they're going to target your Ford Motor plant in Michigan, and you might want to create your own nuclear deterrent. You might want your own anti-ballistic missiles. Well, that's actually exactly what we're doing in cybersecurity. And it's been the policy for the last 20 years, as crazy as it sounds, because there's really no alternative to that idea. There's no way that government can sit in between you and your company and the internet and protect you effectively and do it in a way that doesn't compromise your privacy and your civil liberties. We talk in the book about how China constructed what is called the Great Firewall of China. Now, firewall is a cybersecurity term. But the Great Firewall of China has nothing to do with cybersecurity, and it has everything to do with censorship and surveillance. So when a government sits on the internet and it looks at all the traffic, it's not going to be able to spot an advanced hacker. It's not going to be able to stop a Russian advanced persistent threat group. But it is going to be able to read all your email messages and all your Snapchat and see what news you're consuming. And so from that perspective, the idea that government should take on this responsibility has really been a non-starter. And so as crazy as this policy seemed, right, when Dick first put it out in 1998, it's the same policy that the Bush administration adopted. It's the same policy that the Obama administration continued to build out on. And this is hard for both of us to admit, it's the policy that the Trump administration is continuing to expand on. So this is a good thing.
But while companies are getting more secure, Cyber Command, the U.S. military, is getting into fights. Just recently, one of our drones was shot down by Iran. And the president was about to launch bombers and missiles against Iran. And Tucker Carlson called him, as he often does. You know you're in trouble when Tucker Carlson's the sane one in the room. Tucker Carlson called him and said, wait, don't bomb Iran. That would be wrong. And so Trump launched a cyber attack because somehow that's not as bad. But that's not the only cyber attack we've done lately. The White House intentionally leaked that we have hacked our way into the controls of the Russian power grid because they have hacked their way into the controls of our power grid. Back when the congressional elections were occurring, Cyber Command hacked the Russians and destroyed some of the computers in the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, the people who attacked our election in 2016. So we're attacking Iran, we're attacking Russia, they're attacking us. The risk of cyber war is increasing. And cyber war, we say in the book, can quickly descend into old-fashioned conventional war with bombs and bullets. It's not, oh, we'll just do a cyber war and no one will get killed. Tell that to Hamas. Hamas, the Palestinian group in Gaza, was attacking Israel last month with cyber attacks. And they thought, well, what could go wrong? We're just doing cyber attacks. The Israelis launched 2 F-16s and blew their building up. And that's a metaphor for what we think can happen. The Pentagon's policy, publicly articulated policy, is if the United States gets attacked by a foreign country and we get significantly damaged, they don't say what that means, intentionally vague, we reserve the right to drop bombs and to fire missiles because we were hit by a cyber attack. That's the Pentagon public policy. So cyber war isn't some safe, clean thing where no one gets killed. Cyber war could be an easy way to slide into a real war. And that's why we call in the book for international talks, international negotiations, getting like-minded nations together to secure a piece of cyberspace.
So thus far, what we've tried to do, just to pick up on Dick's point here, thus far, when I was in the Obama administration, our focus was on trying to talk to the Russians and talk to the Chinese and talk some sense into them, right? We were going to try and bring them around to developing norms in cyberspace that reflected our values: freedom of speech, freedom of movement on the internet, accepting that the laws of war apply in cyberspace. Very basic ideas, right? And it turns out that they really had no interest in agreeing to these norms. I know it comes as some surprise. And so what we've been saying in the book is, look, stop trying to convince the Russians and the Chinese and authoritarian regimes that they want to accept our values on the internet. That's not going to happen until they accept our values in the real world. What we're seeing now in China is that what they've done on the internet, they're now doing in the real world. And they're using artificial intelligence and surveillance cameras and linking those up with identity records. And so the internet has become the backbone of the Chinese surveillance state. And they are now exporting that model around the world. I looked up some recent statistics on this from Freedom House. China is in discussions with 30 plus countries around the world on exporting this model of technical surveillance to them. So that's the future they want to build.
The last chapter of the book answers the subtitle. The subtitle says, Securing Our Country, Our Corporations, and Ourselves. And the last chapter in the book is about each of us. How do we stay cyber secure? Any of us, including the two of us, can make the mistake of clicking on a link in an email, and suddenly our computer is taken over. Clicking on an attachment in an email, and suddenly everything, our credit card, all the information on our computer is in China. So how do you stop that? How do you prevent all of that? In the last chapter of the book, we call it de-risking ourselves. We go through 12 simple rules of how each of us can be more secure in cyberspace. Because the government is not going to do it for us. The government's not going to protect us. So far, those of you whose credit cards have been compromised, the credit card company has made you whole. But don't count on that. Don't count on that happening all the time. And other people have had a loss of money from scams that haven't been protected. And the scammers, whether they live in Nigeria or North Korea, are going after Americans, particularly Americans my age. So if you're getting a Social Security check, watch out, because they're coming after you in cyberspace. So take a look at the last chapter of the book, the simple things you can do to help secure yourselves in cyberspace. We could talk all night, and we often do, usually over a bottle of scotch. And about halfway through the bottle of scotch one night, we said, well, let's write another book. So we did. But the best part of coming to these independent bookstores is hearing from you and taking your questions. But before we do, I want a round of applause, not for us, not for our book, but for this wonderful bookstore. And thank you all for supporting this bookstore and independent bookstores across the country. So I think we have mics here and here. And if you just tell us your name and pose your question in the form of a question.
My name is Carolyn Poplin. Mr. Clarke, I've admired you since 9/11, and you first kind of came onto the scene. My question is, the hack that you opened the talk with in Ukraine that cost tens of billions of dollars, how come we didn't hear about it?
Well, you did. I think maybe we, read Wired magazine and other places where you hear about it more often. But I think you did hear at the time, it was 2017, that some of the ports in the United States weren't working. The containers weren't working. The White House held a press conference, which is, I know, a rare thing these days. The White House went into the press briefing room and said this is the worst cyber attack in history, and blamed the Russian military for doing it. So it got some publicity. But you're right, not as much.
As you would expect.
As you would expect. So if an attack is a conventional attack with bombs and missiles and bullets, it leads. If it bleeds, it leads. I, for 15 years, worked with ABC News as a talking head. And I kept trying them to get them to report on cyber attacks. And they could never figure out the visuals. They said, there's no visuals. There's just going to be a guy on the keyboard. That's boring. We need blood. We need bodies. And I think that's the real reason it doesn't get more press.
Well, you hear about cities, who've been that have been shut down.
Yeah, Baltimore and Atlanta, the municipal governments were both hit by this thing called ransomware, where they get in your network and then they encrypt all of your data.
Right.
And they won't let you have access to your own network unless you pay them a lot of money in Bitcoin. Now, we wrote this book agreeing with each other most of the time. But on ransomware, we don't agree. Because we're both consultants, and sometimes the company will call me and sometimes they'll call him. If they call me and they say, we just got hit by ransomware, I say, pay up. Give them the Bitcoin they need. You'll get your network back. And they say, the company always says to me, how can I trust these people? And I say, well, they have a reputation to maintain. They do. Because if people pay up and don't get their network back, no one will pay up again. So there's honor among thieves. And therefore I say, if you want your network back quickly, pay up. He thinks I'm crazy.
So you can go on the dark web, right? The internet for criminals, and you can actually, there's Yelp-like ratings for these ransomware providers. And after you pay the ransom and they've restored your data, they will ask you to rate them and say, yeah.
Oh my God.
Right. So this is happening. People are paying. Well, what's the effect of that, right? So let's just say that these are Russian mobsters and you pay them your Bitcoin and they take 2/3 of it and they spend it on leather jackets and Lamborghinis. What do they do with the other third? Well, they take the other third, like any good commercial enterprise, and they reinvest it. And so every year the attacks are getting bigger, and every year they're getting more sophisticated. They are finding their own vulnerabilities, and it's only going to get worse. So if there was a bad news story about things, we're saying things are getting better, the criminal element is getting far worse. Ransomware used to be something that got onto your computer and you were asked to pay $70 to unlock it.
$300,
Did you pay?
of course.
Yeah.
Now
Right.
it's major cities. Next, it could be the power grid. So I argue, and I don't know how we handled this in the book, but I argued in the book, we should make this illegal. It should not be legal to pay.
I agree. It should be illegal. But since it's not, if you get hit, pay.
Thank you.
You talked a great deal about the attack in Ukraine. Could you talk a little bit about the Russian attacks against the Baltic states and the threat of the cyber attacks in the Baltic states and the responsibility for the U.S. government in response?
So Estonia in 2007 was hit by, I think, probably the first cyber war attack. The Estonians had the temerity to take down the statue of a Russian soldier. The people of Estonia said that giant statue of the Russian soldier was the only Russian soldier that didn't rape people in Estonia. So there's a little resentment against the statue and against Russian troops. And when Estonia became an independent country, one of the things they all wanted to do was take the statue down. Russia went crazy. You can't take down the statue or move the statue of our heroic Soviet soldier. Well, Estonia did. And when they did, all of a sudden nothing worked. None of their computer networks worked. They were attacked by the Russian government. And the Russian government said, no, it wasn't us. It was patriotic citizens of Russia, not the government. As a result, once they got over it, once they restored services, Estonia joined NATO, and Estonia is now the headquarters of NATO's Cyber Command. And they are really good at cybersecurity because they get burned. And we wrote about this in our first book, Cyber War. And one day I was at a conference in Munich, Germany, and this very tall man came up to me and said, "You owe me money." Okay, how much? And why? And he said, "You owe me money because I made people buy your book, Cyber War. I made them all read it." And I said, "Really? Why is that?" And he said, "I made my entire cabinet read it." I said, "You have a cabinet?" He said, "Of course, I'm the president of Estonia." True story.
Thank you.
I was very surprised to recently hear the government come out and say that they had, complete access to the power grid in Russia. My assumption had been is that this is something that you keep quiet until you actually use it. Actually, you don't even talk about it when you use it. You maybe talk about it years later. Which do you think is more effective, and why do you think they came out and advertised their capabilities that way?
So if I'm going to answer this by quoting from Dr. Strangelove, he's going to have to help me. I think what's happening here is a question of, okay, we want to create deterrence, right? Well, if they don't know that we're in their power grid because we're so good that we buried ourselves in so deep and they can't find us, it's not going to create much deterrence if they are thinking about taking out our power grid. And so I think that's the reason that in this very clumsy, ham-fisted way, we've been saying we're in their power grid. We might not even be in their power grid, right? Which is the other possibility, but you're creating some uncertainty in their mind. One of the things we talk about in the book, right, is this desire to figure out how we're going to deter the Russians in this space. And this is a part of it. I actually don't think that it will work because I don't think Vladimir Putin really cares if you turn out the power in Moscow. I'm sure he's got a backup generator, right? What we've seen so far is that Putin, for the greater glory of Russia, is willing to let his people suffer economically. We know that a quarter of people, every time I quote this statistic, I can't believe it's right, a quarter of people in Russia don't have indoor plumbing. So if a quarter of people in Russia don't have indoor plumbing, how much does Vladimir Putin actually care if we turn out the power on the percentage of people who do? And my answer is, I don't think a lot. I think he is more than happy to hurt the United States, to change an electoral outcome by turning off the lights, and let his people suffer the consequences of that.
But I think the reason the White House leaked the story, and there was a White House leak, the White House leaked the story to the press that we are now in the Russian control system for their power grid. I think the reason for that is the head of U.S. intelligence, Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence, had testified publicly to the Congress in March that the Russians were in our power grid control system. And that disturbed a lot of people. And people said, what are you doing about that? And, rather than solving that problem, rather than going in and getting them out of our power grid, apparently the solution was it was easier to get into their power grid. And I think Rob's absolutely right here. If the Russians attack our power grid in the middle of the winter, and we're all cold and the lights are out and we have no cash because the ATMs aren't working and we can't use our credit cards because the credit card machines aren't working and the just-in-time delivery to the supermarkets isn't happening, is it going to make us feel any better on that cold night in Washington in December without the lights? Are you going to feel any warmer if the president says, but I turned their lights out too? There's a line in the book which one of us wrote that says, their lights might be out too, but at least they have vodka.
Yeah, hi. I'm Sean Conley. I work at DHS, at the rebranded cybersecurity agency. We just got up there. I run the TIC program at DHS, the Trusted Internet Connection Program, which is there to protect the agencies and help them build their secure networks to the internet. Rob, I met with you a couple of times there, yeah. My question is just a softball question. What do you think on the civilian side, the .gov networks, what do we got to do to protect them better?
He's letting me handle this because way back in the 20th century, I proposed that the best way to secure federal government networks was to create a federal government network. And I called it GovNet, where all of the federal departments would be operating on a cloud-like, I didn't use the word cloud, but a network that the federal government owned and operated. And I was accused by the ACLU, which I was a member of, and the Electronic Freedom Foundation, which later gave me an award, of being some sort of crypto-fascist for wanting the government to have its own network. I still think that's a good idea. I think if communications among government agencies were on what is now dark fiber that was owned and operated by the government, they'd be more secure. I think gradually we're moving kind of in that direction by having government cloud operations, but.
Yeah. So when I was in government, I guess almost 15 years later, we actually went into the archives and we dug out the plans for GovNet, which were all in paper copies. And we reviewed them. We said, this still makes sense. It's 15 years later. This still makes sense. There's this belief in cybersecurity. You'll hear this if you go out to Black Hat in August. There's this idea that the perimeter is dead. There's no such thing as a perimeter in cybersecurity. And that's absolute and utter nonsense, right? You can create a perimeter in cyberspace wherever you want to. It's the nature of cyberspace. It's mutable. It's man-made. The real advantage with GovNet, from my perspective, wasn't the technical controls. It was the governance controls. It was the ability to give, in this case, DHS, the authority to shut off internet for an agency that is out of compliance. Right now, DHS can do that through these orders that the Secretary of Homeland Security can write. And nobody knows what would happen if an agency said, screw you, Jack. You're going to put me in cybersecurity jail? You don't actually have any authority, right? Well, the Department of Defense does have that authority. The Department of Defense operates its own Tier 2 internet service provider around the world. And when we went and talked to people at DoD about this, they said they had only had to shut down a combatant command once for being out of compliance. And that got everybody else to understand who was in charge. So that is a non-technical answer to your very technical question, which we could discuss at a later date.
Thank you for working in the cybersecurity agency at DHS.
Thank you. Be fair, there's some of my colleagues in the audience here too, so thank you.
Hi, my name is Julia Phillip, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the difference between the companies that are spending 3 to 4% of their, I guess, investment budgets.
Their IT budget.
Their IT, 3 to 4% of their IT budget? Yeah. On cybersecurity compared to 8 to 10% on cybersecurity. Could you elaborate a little bit more on where the greatest impact of that additional spend is between the 3 to 4% companies and the 8 to 10% companies? Is it like cyber hygiene or, yeah, I wouldn't think so. So what makes the biggest impact?
When I started doing this stuff in 1997, again in the dark ages, if you wanted to protect your network, you could buy only 3 things. You could buy a firewall, you could buy an antivirus system, and around 1998, you could buy this new thing called an intrusion detection system. Very exciting. And so I think people got used to the idea you can't spend very much on IT security. IT security is not a big ticket item. And then the technology moved on. And when we talk to people who are running big networks for AT&T or for Bank of America or for JP Morgan, they don't have 3 cybersecurity applications or devices. They have 50 or 60, or in one case, 74. 74 different security applications running on a network, each of them solving one little problem. That can add up. And then you have to integrate them all, make them all work together, orchestrate them all together. So where do they spend the money? JP Morgan has 1,400 people.
240. Oh, working in IT.
Working on IT security.
So they have 14,000 people working on IT and about 1,000 people working on IT security. If Sean was still here, he is still here. How many people work at DHS on cybersecurity?
4,000, yeah. So a lot of the money goes for people, and a lot of the money goes for software. And frankly, the more software you have, the more people you need, because you need to integrate all of this stuff. The notion that the robots are taking over, not fast. Applications require people. People need to read the results. People need to make decisions. Trained, highly skilled people, and they're in short supply. And so, I don't know what if you look at the salary, just the salary of a woman who's running information security for, let's say, JP Morgan or Bank of America. What do you think she's making? Just base salary. $500,000. $500,000 a year plus stock options. So the money goes fast when you're paying that kind of salary.
Thank you.
I'm Enzo. You were talking about how as technology advanced, it became like easier to defend from cyber attacks. Do you feel like there will reach a point where cyber attacks will become obsolete because of how advanced technology is?
I mean, that's the hope. I think we're pretty far away from that. We talked to a guy who said that maybe by 2050, we would start to see the ability to have software writing software in a secure way. So that's not a near-term proposition.
I think that's right. We talk about artificial intelligence taking over. A I have in the book this idea that there will be a master AI, one AI to rule them all, that will just run the network, and it'll see attacks and it'll kill them, and it'll be software writing software. That may happen in your lifetime. It's not happening in mine.
But so, to add to that, right? If you're a small business today, get everything you're doing into the cloud, right? If you do that, you get the thousands of people at Microsoft or Apple or Google or Amazon who are in charge of security there working for you. That shifts responsibility tremendously. It also shifts the advantage significantly from the attacker to the defender, right? For a very small relative amount of money, you're going to be able to improve your cybersecurity. Now, the reason I raise this is sort of an overall metaphor for the direction that security is heading in, right? As we lower costs to security, as we take what cost JP Morgan $1 billion and only a JP Morgan size entity can do and bring it down to small business, that's happening at a much lower cost. And so from that perspective, it's getting cheaper to defend and it's getting harder to attack. And those are good trends.
And before you think JP Morgan is spending a lot of money, or Bank of America is spending a lot of money, $1 billion a year, that's about 8% of their IT budget. I mean, they spend a lot of money on IT.
So would they become, like you were talking about how it wouldn't be governments that are like, that need to protect, it would be like those big companies? So like people would, they would be the ones that are like leading?
They protect themselves. They don't rely on government. Yep.
Thank you.
Last question?
Thank you very much. It's wonderful. In conventional warfare, you've had progressive escalation until you've reached the absolute deterrence of the nuclear bomb. In cyber warfare, isn't this the possibility of progressive escalation, response and non-response, and even intersection with interfering and using the nuclear bomb? And then isn't that a possibility? You're very positive or optimistic about the ability to deter aggressive cyber attacks. And is that 100%? Or
No.
80%?
No, I'm not that confident that we can deter cyber attacks.
Okay.
I think we should try. I think that's a good strategy. But no, I'm not at all confident. I think if we get into a crisis of rising tensions between us and Iran or us and Russia or us and China, I think there's a real incentive right now to go first with a cyber attack. Knock out their power grid before they can knock out yours. I think that creates crisis instability, and that can really quickly jump from cyberspace into the other four domains and result in a conventional war. I don't think we understand very well what a cyber war would look like. Nuclear war, as crazy as it was empirical. It had data, it had numbers. Cyber war, not so much. And therefore, that's why we advocate cyber peace. Arms control, confidence building measures, risk reduction measures. I'm going to tell you a little inside baseball on this book. When we originally tried to get the book published, we had a different name for it. It wasn't called The Fifth Domain.
You know this is being recorded, right?
Oh, no, it's being recorded? Oh, no. The original name of this book was Cyber Peace. How to get to cyber peace. And it's still the same content. The book is about how to get to cyber peace. Because cyber war, we think, is too risky.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.